Hello, hello, dear friend. Thank you so much for joining us and watching us today. Welcome to the American Space Program, which is called Philosophical Talks with Stephen Friedman, a great philosopher who was acclaimed a genius philosopher by New York Times. Today we have an interesting topic. You know that this week's topic is election campaign, and we will talk today about this topic and about the convergence in action. So Mr. Friedman, initially, he will answer the questions from the previous session, and then we will proceed with the new topic. So Mr. Friedman.
Thank you very much, Sharon. I want to thank, again, everyone at the American Consulate in Almaty for making these talks possible. I especially also want to thank Tracy Kimbut and Consul General Eric Meyer. Yes, this week's talk is going to start with questions for the first time. And I think that's a good approach. For one reason, it gives me a chance to think about them a little bit, but it also gives you a chance, to maybe think about, questions that others have raised or that you yourself have raised, maybe research them to some degree, give yourself some additional perspective, maybe put yourself in a position to understand the position that I take in answering these questions, any similarities and differences in terms of what you might be expecting can be helpful. It's also helpful when you're doing philosophy to be thinking through some of these issues as much as possible yourself. The philosopher Wittgenstein that I refer to, almost every talk, because he was a major influence upon my work, my thinking, my results, stressed that his particular results were likely only to be understood by people who had independently arrived at them, independently had those thoughts. Then they would fully make sense. I sometimes like to think that the difference between a philosophical process and understanding and, say, something that we experience, in terms of an artwork. Art can convey philosophical ideas, but an art is something that we see with our eyes. Philosophy is something that we have to see through our eyes, through our own eyes. So it's going to affect fundamentally how we see, how we experience the world and every aspect of that world, not just what we experience when we walk into a museum, but what we experience just looking around, what we experience looking at a piece of furniture. We were talking about furniture last week. Okay, so we had some good questions at the end, and it's always possible to take any one of these questions and make it the entire substance of a talk. I'm going to try to avoid doing that. I'm going to try to limit myself so we have enough time to deal with the issues relating to the election campaign. And I want to also just make everyone aware that I'm not so interested in the details of this particular election campaign, but of election campaigns in general, like what their value is, what they signify, what role they have in the decision-making process of American democracy, American representative democracy as it's been conceived, constructed, realized, in the Constitution, in the vision of founding fathers, and in the nature of the philosophical aspects of decision-making itself. Okay, so first, the first question that I want to look at, and I'm going to just, so I make sure I have it exact. Okay, I think Ansgar asked a question about the changing perception of philosophy, that some people say philosophy is not necessary. Well, this goes to the core of what we're doing, the value of philosophy. Now, what I find, and I mentioned this previously, is that philosophy is not well understood. It's not well understood even by professors of philosophy. It doesn't seem to be fully understood by professors of philosophy at Harvard. I know that sounds an extreme position to take, but anybody doing philosophy ambitiously always feels that they're clarifying and to some degree discovering the nature of the subject, the true nature of it. So it's not unusual to hear that type of position coming from a philosopher. Well, first thing to keep in mind is that we don't need to use the term philosophy at all. Philosophy is simply the limit of rigor. And whereas philosophy may have a questionable past in the sense that a lot of philosophical work has not stood the test of time, rigor is something that has to stand the test of time, or it's not a rigorous result. And I've emphasized that rigor can best be understood through not a body of rigorous results, but through a process of discovering and discarding what isn't rigorous. And what isn't rigorous is any claim that we make, that we attempt to make about two things where there's any distinction at all between those two objects or elements or people. Because rigorously, at the limit of rigor, and again, I'm using rigor not in the way that it's sometimes often used in the sciences, in terms of a rigorous experiment. A rigorous experiment in science is only somewhat rigorous, aspirationally aspiring to be rigorous as philosophy sees it. And the point I've made, and there are a number of ways to visit this issue, but simply the fact that the world is different in different directions means that a controlled experiment in science is not rigorously possible. And even if the world was identical in different directions, the fact that we recognize direction at all, the fact that if we're doing a controlled experiment and we have a control group here and an experimental group here, the fact that one is to the left of the other means that there is a distinction. And from the standpoint of absolute rigor, that means that what applies to one need not apply to the other. And that becomes what in science is called a confounding variable that makes it impossible to draw a rigorous conclusion from the experiment. We can draw approximate results. Okay, so philosophy aspires to something very elevated. Now, the point of that, and in general, that aspect of philosophy, that's the core of what philosophy is doing, is not appreciated. But rigor is. I mean, when you if you look through a lot of contemporary writings, internet publications, you'll see that word a lot. It's one of the things that has the highest value, the highest esteem, the highest regard. That's what people are aspiring to, a rigorous result. Well, the only thing achieving a fully rigorous result is philosophy. That's it. Now, in terms of what does that limit of rigor accomplish? Well, again, it's a process to get there, and I've given you some indications of how to do that, but it's still something that needs to be worked at and that we need to revisit, and we might need to revisit this a number of times, and it would take effort as well on your part to try to see the world through a set of rigorous eyes, if you like. But what that rigor ultimately accomplishes, and I'm not going to develop this because it'll take too long right now, but just keep it in mind, we've talked about it before, we'll talk about it again. It achieves what the religions have aspired to at the limit of their hopes and aspirations. It achieves, if you like, enlightenment as far as the Buddhist position or perspective is concerned. It achieves salvation within the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition. It achieves rigorously what the religions aspire to in terms of their conceptions of of God, or so it's giving a kind of logic to those concepts, those religious concepts. It's giving them a firm foundation, but only at its limit, okay? In the same way that it's been said that in Buddhism, there's Siddhartha Gautama, the historical Buddha. That's the person who lived like 2,500 years ago and developed what we recognize as Buddhism. And it became the basis for what's called the Theravada tradition of Buddhism, the type of Buddhism practiced in mostly like Southeast Asia, where that form of Buddhism recognizes Siddhartha Gautama as a historical figure that lived and developed these ideas and these insights as a human being addressing these fundamental issues of human life. There's another tradition that developed later called the Mahayana tradition. And in that tradition, there are many Buddhas historically and to come. And there's a whole set of concepts associated with that. Well, the most important figure in Mahayana tradition is a 2nd century AD writer, Nagarjuna. Nagarjuna wrote this work, Madhyamika Karikas, the verses on the middle way. The middle way is a term sometimes describing Buddhism. Well, Nagarjuna, for all of his elevation of thought, was only considered to have achieved the 7th level of enlightenment, Siddhartha having achieved the 10th. So the point is that it's hard to get to the limit, of these explorations of understanding, okay? But only at its limit does philosophy achieve the results that I'm claiming for it. And some of these results are translatable into relatively easy terms, like going back to Socrates. We suffer, not because of what we know, and not because of what we do not know, and not because of what we think not because of what we cannot know, but because of what we think we know, unjustifiably. So at that level, philosophy is providing a solution to the problems of human life, a solution even to the problems of life and death, okay? So it has that power. Then, I don't want to spend too much time, but it's also been instrumental in motivating and advancing some of the most important results, for example, in the sciences. Einstein and Heisenberg, the creators of relativity theory and quantum mechanics, the 2 most important results of modern physics, were basically doing the physics of existentialism. They were trying to describe the world from within the world. They themselves saw themselves as doing philosophy or injecting their thinking about physics and the problems of physics with a fundamental philosophical perspective. So to achieve that highest level takes philosophy. There's a story I'll tell. I think I have time to tell this. I was once meeting with a literary agent, a famous literary agent called Mort Janklow. That was his name. He was the literary agent, the person that you went to if you were a president or a pope or the world's best-selling author, and you wanted him to represent you. And he would represent people at that level, okay? Well, somehow or other, I was able to arrange a meeting with him. I was there to discuss a specific project, but in the course of this meeting, I ended up also describing some other projects, a variety of projects that I had in different directions, some in molecular biology, some in the direction of film, nature of film marketing, some in the direction of typography, how to print a page, just a diversity of results. And at one point, he stops me, Mort Janklow, and says, "Where are all these results coming from?" And I said to him, "A central core of philosophical analysis." And at that point, he stops me and he says, where you're sitting, Steven Weinberg, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist, was once sitting. And he said to me, at the highest level, physics becomes philosophy. So again, at the highest levels, the level of Einstein and Heisenberg and Steven Weinberg, physics is infused with philosophical thinking and understanding. And aside from just in general, philosophy representing the limit of rigor represents the most precise type of thought possible. So there's a sense of the value that philosophy can have, but it's really going to be illustrated in all of these talks, okay? Now, I was asked about Martin Heidegger, what I think of Martin Heidegger, a 20th century German existentialist philosopher. And here I will be much briefer. Heidegger's writings are difficult, they're confusing. And the reason they're confusing, and I don't mean to be disrespectful, but I'm going to be rigorously philosophical here. The reason they are confusing is that Heidegger was confused in what he was doing philosophically. He was oriented as an existentialist. So he recognized the effort, the interest in understanding the world from within the world. But he tried to do it by taking himself outside the world, as it were. So trying to understand the nature of the existential circumstance from outside that circumstance. That's a fundamental error in thinking. That's his fundamental error in thinking. It's a common error in thinking, even when you're doing existentialism. Because I find that every existentialist that I've read hasn't fully, completely grasped the implications of not being able to see the world from without. That they give it a certain lip service, that they acknowledge it in words, but not in their actual philosophical practice. So I find Martin Heidegger's works deficient at a fundamental level. Okay, there, that's my, yes. I've read him, I've tried to read him, but he hasn't engaged me. And I never understood fully why he wasn't engaging me until I developed my own results more. And I would look back at him and I could see, okay, this is the problem with what he's struggling with. Okay, so Heidegger. And then finally, I have a question. Philosophy teaches common sense. Religion says, restrain yourself from vices. Can people live a fulfilled life without ethics? Okay. Few comments. Again, I will not go into this in as much detail as I might otherwise like to, but we'll come back to these kinds of issues, these topics. So if you don't feel that I'm fully answering, these issues will be answered, in the course of my talks in general. But philosophy is actually not common sense. It's uncommon sense, in the sense that we think death is certain, right? Why wouldn't we think death is certain? Everyone, that's lived before us has died. Well, philosophy at the limit of rigor doesn't recognize the certainty of that, because everyone that came before us was different from us in some way. And so what has applied to anyone who came before need not apply to us. So whatever is the common understanding tends to be rejected by philosophy because it doesn't stand up to the tests, the assessments of rigor. Okay? Philosophy, again, is destroying a lot of what people seem to have faith in or belief in, confidence in. What philosophy is really destroying is what we might call houses of cards. Things that we think are substantial, things that we think are the rock of truth, but not. The only opinion, theory, assumption, belief, the results of science, that's not rigorous. Those are short of rigor. Though that is not the truth that sets us free. That's a famous kind of claim, in the Western, Bible. The truth shall make you free. Yes, it shall. It will make you free from the past. It will make you free from your expectations as to the future. It will make you free from any sense of limitation that you might have by comparing yourself with others or with your past experiences or behaviors, your past failures. But it only sets you free, again, at the limit of rigor, where any difference between your present circumstance and your past set of circumstances means that what has applied in the past need not apply now or in the future. And that includes all of our concepts. That includes the Buddhist concern, disease, old age, and death. The fact that others have died does not rigorously mean that we will. And the only solution to the world here and now is in that rigorous space. Everything else is just our belief or expectation. And if you believe in God, God is a God of rigor, of precision, not of vagueness, not of approximations, but of absolute precision. Now, in terms of the issue of ethics, ethics exists within social systems, fundamentally. Social systems are what I call heuristic spaces, not rigorous spaces. There's a famous Buddhist proclamation that philosophy can help explain and embrace. It goes, die while alive and be completely dead. Then do whatever you will. All is good. In other words, a religious space, a fully embodied religious experience or vision, like Buddhist enlightenment, just as a philosophic space at the limit of rigor, is, as Nietzsche, the philosopher Nietzsche, had suggested, beyond good and evil. Now, that doesn't mean that a philosopher is going to be acting in all kinds of willful and evil ways, because it turns out that a lot of what motivates evil is a sense of need, a sense of limitation, a sense of something about our circumstances that philosophy is able to undermine, undercut. Show us that what we think we need, what often motivates evil, crime, wickedness, non-ethical behavior is based upon a misunderstanding of our fundamental circumstances, a misunderstanding of what we think to be our needs. So again, philosophy frees us from that ethical space so that we act what others from the outside would see ethically, simply because we don't have the kind of needs, desperate desires that often enchain human beings. Again, it's that limit of rigor providing a freedom, an escape from the burden of our sense of self based on the past, our sense of need, our expectations relative to the future. It is a liberation. Okay, so that's a little bit about those questions, and I think it's time to go on. Okay, so today's topic, again, elections, election campaigns, an election campaign, not again this specific one. And what election campaigns are doing, what elections are doing, is providing a means of decision making, right? We're going to select one candidate over another. We're going to select one proposition over another. We're making decisions. Okay, so there are two circumstances in which we make decisions. There is decision-making within a philosophic space, as I call it. Remember, another term I use for that is just an equivalent term, epistemic space. That's just a rigorous space. These all mean the same thing. Epistemic space, rigorous space, philosophic space, a space in which, or a circumstance in which we are seeing the world in rigorous terms. We're not jumping to unjustified conclusions. Okay? Well, that's one realm to make decisions. And then the other situation in which we make decisions is when we're not in that kind of circumstance or thinking in those terms. Now, in terms of the rigorous philosophical type of decision making, I've talked about it before, but again, I think it's good to talk about it again, because I don't think we could revisit these ideas often enough. And especially since decision making is everywhere. You know, it's the nature of intelligence. Our intelligence as human beings, as intelligent animals. It infuses activities that we don't often think of as being fully formed by a conscious decision-making process. The 19th century painter, Manet, an impressionist painter and actually a forerunner of impressionism, French artist, said, painting is a thing of intelligence. The reason he said that is, you start with a blank canvas, and everything that goes onto that canvas is the result of a decision, a conscious decision that has to be made, to a greater degree than, for example, the art of film or photographic art, where as much as the director and the cinematographer are manipulating, you know, what the camera is seeing, the camera still, if it's focused on the world in any direction, there's a lot that's present. The director, you know, can make decisions about what to emphasize and how to light and whatever, but usually they're not starting from a blank canvas. A painting, typically a blank canvas, and everything that goes on it has to be the product of a conscious decision. Animation actually is similar, but animation is like drawing, it's a similar kind of art. So decision-making is everywhere. It's not just in the political process. But the most important thing about decision-making is not how we make the decision, but how we know whether we've made a good one, a correct one, the better one, the best one. Rigorously, can't ever know. So rigorously, there's no such thing as an intelligent decision-making process. I sometimes use, we can use the example about anything. We use it about, you know, two political candidates. I usually use it about like the question of going to Harvard or Yale, because that was a decision I had to make, and I probably spent more time making that decision than any subsequent decision I've made. So it gave me a lot of experience with that process. And that process took maybe a month for me to make, and that meant a month every day when I was weighing, you know, options and considerations. The problem is, again, ask yourself, how would you know? I ended up going to Harvard, okay? But I can't compare what might have happened had I gone to Yale, right? I mean, in order to make that comparison, I'd have to rewind in time and then go to Yale. And that situation wouldn't even be identical because I would have gone to Harvard first. And that might influence something about the nature of my experience at Yale. And even if I were able to rewind in time and do one thing and then do the other, even if we could elect one person to the presidency, see how they do over 4 years, rewind, give the other person the opportunity, see how they do, well, that doesn't resolve the issue, because maybe the difference emerges in the 5th year or the 6th. Maybe after 4 years, person A, decision A, Harvard looks like the better outcome, but the 6th year, the 7th, or the 8th, or the 10th, or the 20th, or the 30th turns out to reveal that Yale ultimately was the better choice. There's a famous comment that Mao Zedong, the Chinese communist leader, said in response to the question, what do you, and he was, 20th century figure, what do you think of the French Revolution? He was asked. And his response, too soon to tell. Well, when he was asked that question, the French Revolution was, 200 years in the past. Too soon to tell. That's the nature of our living experience, that tomorrow or the next day or the day after that or the end of time could change our sense of what the right direction to have gone in was. So rigorously, we can't make a comparison that's meaningful, that can decide the issue. So rigorously, what does one do? Within a philosophic space, rigorously one flips a coin. Can't matter. I mean, there are other reasons why it won't matter, okay? But that gives you, I think, an indication of how philosophy rigorously thinks about a decision-making process. And you can see how this is going to apply to every decision, including a political decision, right? The most important thing is we want to know what the ultimate benefit of having made one choice versus another. And the answer is we can't know because we can't ever do the comparison. We think we can. We think we can do the comparison because we're making approximate comparisons. We might do the experiment of letting one person, be in office for 4 years and letting the next person, take over for the next 4 years and think, well, it's kind of approximately the same. Yeah, it's approximately the same. But that doesn't rise to the level of philosophical significance. It doesn't pass the philosophical tests of rigor. And so philosophically, we are freed from the stress, the anxiety, people get invested, right, in candidates, in their choices, in their decisions. I advise people on college choices a lot, and people rack their brains over what to do, what decision to make. And I tell them, you can flip a coin here because you're never going to be able to do the relevant comparison. And what you think might be a good justification for one choice, again, you can't ever know. So what I'm saying is that you don't need to be as invested in the outcome. It's not a matter of life and death because you cannot know. So far as you can ever know, even if the decision goes against what you would otherwise embrace, that might have been the better decision, but there's no way to determine ever in principle. So we don't need to be quite so life and death invested. That's what philosophy is freeing us from, okay? And that's, what a religious figure will feel free of as well, right? There's a certain equanimity, a calmness of spirit that the religious spirit embodies for various reasons, maybe because the world is in God's hands, let's say, or if it's a Buddhist, because they've embraced, the nature of nirvana, of enlightenment, that's ended all concepts. Whatever it is, they're facing experience with a certain calmness of spirit. And another way to illustrate that, and I feel like I should because the point is so important. I've given this example before. It's a famous example. It's used in a film, Charlie Wilson's War. It came out, I don't know, maybe 20 years ago, where the story is told of a Zen master and a young boy. A young boy in a village who's given a horse for his 14th birthday. And everyone in the village says, how wonderful, how wonderful. And the Zen master says, we'll see. One day, a few years later, the boy is riding the horse. He falls off. He breaks his leg in multiple places, and he can't ever walk well again. Everyone says, how terrible, how terrible. The Zen master says, we'll see. A few years go by. A war breaks out. All the young men in the village go off to war, except for this young boy who can't serve because of his physical condition. And everyone says, oh, how wonderful, can't go off to war. And the Zen master says, of course, we'll see. That's the nature of the process. Okay, that's the nature of our living circumstance. Okay, but we are making decisions, right? We are voting, right? We are selecting one candidate over another. We're making a choice between Harvard and Yale. Within this approximate space, this heuristic space, as I call it, this non-rigorous space, what do? What's the mode of decision-making appropriate to that space, to the normal world we see around us, the world of objects? Well, that space around us is what I call a convergent space, where things are coming together. Remember, a rigorous space is one where everything is significantly different from everything else, and so things don't get grouped together. Okay? That's why it's what I call an aconceptual space. No concepts conform in that space because concepts group things together, group all balls or all the kind of things that we call balls, or chairs, or all the kind of things we call chairs. But from a rigorous standpoint, there's distinctions to be made, and those distinctions are more important than the similarities. Okay, but a space, a heuristic space in which things are clustering. In the case of objects, which clustering is our past experience of the object or similar objects, our present sensation that groups them together as a thing, an object of one type of thing, a chair, our expectation for how that's going to perform. That's what I call a convergence of elements. Everything you see around you, everything in heuristic space is a convergence. Well, that's and in general, the more elements that come together, the stronger the convergence. And this is a guide for actual creation within this space. Like, we never can know when we're putting things together in a new way for the first time exactly what we're going to achieve, how it's going to function. When we're trying to envision, create a cancer cure, a treatment for cancer, we sort of put things together, we imagine a certain process, we kind of have ideas as to what might work, and ideas kind of come together to suggest a possible approach, a solution. We have to test it, can't know for sure, right? That's the nature of any kind of convergent sort of process. We can't know for sure because every set of factors that come together is either a new set of factors or coming together at a new place, a new time. And that can make all the difference. Okay, that can be a reason why something that succeeded before fails the next time because something is different the next time. Okay, and any difference can be the decisive difference. Well, but in general, just as a guide to discovery, as a guide to decision making, the principle we use in a convergent space is the more convergence is, the stronger the result. We go in the direction of the greater convergence. And that's not just a guideline, but that's an analysis of what we do. If we, choose Harvard over Yale, we're choosing it because there are more things about Harvard that we like. Maybe certain departments that it has that we prefer, because our interest is physics and philosophy. And the departments there are better than the departments at Yale, maybe certain aspects of the environment. So we're summing up all the factors, maybe the reputation, maybe the endowment, maybe the location in terms of the weather. All of these things come together in our assessment. They are convergent factors, okay? We choose the stronger convergence. Now, the stronger convergence, without getting into the details of convergence theory, but the stronger convergence is a matter of both the number of things coming together and the weight of those things, right? That there might be 50, and it's what we do when we create lists and compare them. If there are 15 reasons in favor of Harvard and 10 reasons in favor of Yale, we might choose Harvard, except if some of those factors in favor of Yale are really, really strong. And then that might, so convergence, those things that come together, that weigh in our choice of one thing over the other, choosing the stronger convergence, is a matter both of the number of factors and the strength of individual factors, the weight of individual factors. And as human beings, we weigh factors differently. For example, when it comes in general to like a candidate, okay, for one thing, the ultimate decision in an election process is made how? By number of votes, right? The greater number of votes chooses the next president or senator or congressman, mayor, whatever you're voting for. Why? Well, the greater the number of votes, the greater the number of convergent elements. And in a democracy, a modern democracy, all the votes are equal. We can imagine in earlier systems, more feudal systems, some people's votes carrying more weight than others, right? We can imagine a system where the nobility and we've seen some systems like that. The nobility and the priesthood, carried greater weight in their votes than the peasantry. Okay, like I'm thinking to the France of the pre-French Revolution. But in modern times, in contemporary times, we have an equality, right, of voting. And so it's simply a matter of the greater number of votes, the winner. That when we're not giving different weight to different people's votes, then it comes down simply to a matter of number. Okay? And the greater the number of votes, the greater the convergence on that object. That's the winner. Okay? That's the logic of that process. Now, what we are doing in an election campaign is what? We are seeing different aspects of the candidates. Right? And the reason we are seeing different aspects of the candidates is because those different aspects are creating what? A convergent picture of that candidate, where we're seeing, the whole election campaign is presenting different elements, accomplishments, aspirations, but everything factors in. Everything that we experience, every time we see a candidate, that's a new convergent element. That's another exposure, another encounter, another convergence. And all of these things add up. Every political ad that we see gets weighed in our mind. And of course, these things are all being weighed individually, right? The way you may weigh something is different than the way your neighbor may, or the way I may. But it all sums together. And you ultimately, it sums together to a singular choice where all of those experiences, all of the things you've read, all the things you've seen, add up to a greater convergence on one candidate than on the other, and that's the person for whom you cast your vote. Now, and that's the point of the whole campaign, to expose different aspects, of the candidate so that you create this convergent picture in your mind that ultimately leads to the choice. And again, the analysis is you're choosing the more robust object, the one where, from your perspective, as you evaluate the convergent elements, has the stronger convergent result. Okay. Now, it's interesting, in political science at Harvard, I didn't take political science courses there, but I had friends that did. There was, I don't know if this is still a prevalent view, but there was a popular political science position that voting doesn't really give power to the people casting the votes, because there are so many votes cast, and each individual vote represents such a small fraction, right? A minuscule fraction of the total, that it's not so much, voting is not so much conferring power on the individual that's voting, but the illusion of power, the illusion of participating in a process where their actual, the actual degree of control they have over it is vanishingly small, to the point where it's an illusion. It doesn't really matter. This is not true. This is a political science position where, again, we're thinking in terms of concepts and approximations. In philosophy, we're assessing things rigorously. And from a philosophical standpoint, everything matters. Every vote matters. Because it's not just a matter of who gets the total, the greater number of votes. The absolute number of votes matters. The difference in number between the candidates matters. The more votes someone gets relative to the other candidate, the greater we call the mandate to governance. So every additional vote makes a difference. Every additional vote makes an impression, contributes to the overall impression. Again, rigorously, because philosophy attends to everything. So, and anything that is discernible, if you can see a difference in between 55 million and one vote and 55 million and two, if you can see it, it in principle has an effect. Okay, so sometimes people feel that, well, this one candidate is going to win. Why do I need to go to the polls? Because it matters. Everything adds up. In this world, in a convergent space, everything matters. That's the nature of that space, ultimately. And I think I made the point before that where we exist, to exist, where I exist right here, right now, can be represented as the sum of the entire universe at this point where I am. And ultimately, and this is a little bit of a difficult idea, but I just want to say it so you hear it. Ultimately, the reason why that is that fundamental existential point. We can't leave the world. We can't leave the world to see that everything is the same now, even when we're not here. So far as we can ever know, we represent the sum of everything at this point. Okay? So everything matters. There's an aphorism I wrote at the end of my first philosophy book, my first book of aphorisms a long time ago now. As of the sparrow, it's a reference to a biblical, the Western Bible. As of the sparrow, where God is aware of everything that happens, that not a sparrow can fall to earth without God being aware of it, right? As of the sparrow, everything matters. That's true in a rigorous space. That's true for elections as well, okay? All the votes matter. Okay, now, we are in a representative democracy in the United States and in general. I mean, it's hard to have pure democracies, especially when you have large numbers of people. Greece in ancient Athens had a pure democracy, but at its height, I think the population of Greece was about 25,000 people, and only a fraction of those were actually voting. There were children, there were women, they were not voting. There were people that didn't own property, they weren't voting. So the actual number of people sort of casting votes and making decisions moment to moment was small. It was manageable. One could do that. Actually, interestingly, technology provides a mechanism by which that could become a possibility of direct democracy, right? You can imagine a society where, every decision, is made, with everybody contributing, on their computer to the overall result. That wasn't the vision, though, even if it had been practical, of the founding fathers of the United States. The founding fathers of the United States were primarily concerned with achieving a system of government that could avoid an undue concentration of power anywhere within the government, anywhere. So, and it's an idea. The way they sought to achieve that relied upon the ideas of a French 18th century philosopher, political philosopher, Montesquieu, who talked about a system of balance of power, checks and balances, right? We have a system, an elaborate system in the United States of checks and balances. We have a judicial system, a court system with its own internal structure. We layers and levels for kind of checking decisions. We have a legislative branch, the House of Representatives and the Senate, which is making the laws. We have an executive branch, the president and various agencies, under the presidency, and all of these branches have interact in different ways and limit the power, the absolute power that any one sort of branch can exert. Now, what that's achieving partly is a certain inherent conservatism in the system, so that we're not jumping to conclusions and all rushing in one direction of decision making, like almost prematurely. The founding fathers were concerned about overly premature, decisions that we might make. I used the example last time of a chair, and why the chair, like that you might see in front of you, and wherever you might be right now, why that chair is sitting where it is, and the alternative, as I was suggesting, is if all of its atoms, all of its molecules, all of its component parts happened to line up in an instant. Let's say they lined up so that they were all directed upwards, the chair in front of you, to the left, to the right, would fly into space in the next instant. The only reason why it's not is the number of such component particles is so vast, and that the likelihood of they're all lining up in one direction is remote. I mean, one can calculate probabilities based upon the number of atoms and molecules, and the chances of them all lining up is less than the amount of time the universe exists and is likely to ever exist for that to happen. So it's an unlikely event, but not theoretically impossible. Well, in a society, American society, any society, if everyone happened to be lined up in their decision-making orientation, then yes, then we could go in any given direction without restraint. Okay, it tends not to happen because of the number of component parts that tend to exert opposing positions. It's one of the values of having different political parties. It's one of the values of having elections, right? That periodically we're able to sort of have a judgment as to whether that individual in power should continue in power. Having that ability to decide that is a limit on that person's ultimate power, right? One of the things that the founding fathers were most concerned about avoiding was tyranny of some form or other. And there were different tyrannies that they were interested in avoiding. One was the obvious tyranny, of a king, a monarch, a dictator, right? And so we have a president, not a monarch, right? And the president gets elected, and he's not president for life. And though interestingly, the Constitution in its original form would have permitted somebody, if he or she were popular enough, to be president for life. The fact that we have the system that we do, functioning the way it has historically, is not just the embodiment of that system in the Constitution, but how individuals have related to the principles that the Constitution expresses. So, for example, George Washington famously was as popular, a leader as this country has probably ever had, right? And he famously could have become president for life if he had wanted. He was that popular. But after 2 terms, he voluntarily withdrew from public life, did not run for a 3rd term, and that set a precedent. And that precedent was honored until Franklin Roosevelt, who was reelected 3 times. So he served 4 terms. He didn't complete his 4th term. He died in office. But the crisis, of the Depression and of World War II was such that people trusted in that leadership. It's often the case that in times of crisis, the government does tend to be more aligned in a given direction to achieve results. When there isn't a crisis, there tends to be what we call gridlock, like opposing positions tend to block like any one position from asserting itself too strongly. But in times of crisis, where you have to respond with some degree of unity, as again during like World War II and the Depression, Roosevelt was reelected, did serve, was voted into office 4 times, but then a constitutional amendment, was passed to prevent that from happening again, limiting the presidency to 2 terms. But so basically, but even before that, the fact that the president had to run for re-election every 4 years, no matter what, was a check on the amount of power that could come to that individual. The Founding Fathers were also concerned about a concentration of power in the people themselves. This is something that the French philosopher, political scientist de Tocqueville of the early 19th century wrote about. But it was something that the Founding Fathers were aware of, that it's possible for the people to align in such a way that they suppress, like the rights, a majority might suppress the rights of a minority in the society. That there could be a tyranny of the majority will, that what the majority wanted could corrupt the fundamental principles of the society as it was conceived, because it was in their interest, their personal interests, to do so. One of the blocks on the possible tyranny of a majority, of the popular will, and one of the reasons why they were aware of this was the Founding Fathers read a lot of classic literature. They read Shakespeare, and Shakespeare, in a number of plays, Julius Caesar, Coriolanus, talks about the crowd, sort of being willful and manipulatable, okay? And the Founding Fathers wanted to protect even against the tyranny of the crowd. And one of the ways they did that, and this is a topic of constant discussion, is the Electoral College. As it's still constituted, the citizens of the United States cast votes, in each state, in the state that they reside in, for, let's say, a presidential candidate. But the final decision about that candidate, about how those votes are going to be sort of convergently assessed and processed, is made by a group of what are called electors. And those electors serve as for the Founding Fathers, a kind of barrier against the popular will going crazy, doing something that's not ultimately in the best interest of the society as the Founding Fathers conceived it. So even there we see a kind of a check and a conservative check on the different aspects, features of society to keep it from going too extreme in one direction without sufficient thought or deliberation or care. It's interesting, the founding fathers obviously were creating a new government. They were creating a new government at a time when conservatism as a political philosophy was being developed by Edmund Burke, a famous 18th century English writer, parliamentarian, intellectual. I don't know if I've mentioned before the figure Samuel Johnson. Samuel Johnson is considered one of the greatest of all English men of letters. He was actually the first person to write critical texts, commentaries on Shakespeare, and establish Shakespeare as the great English writer. Comes from Samuel Johnson's work. He was also a poet. He wrote criticism of the works of other poets. Again, considered the greatest English man of letters, writer about literature, commenter, critic of literature. Not the greatest English writer, or the greatest writer in the English language, that's Shakespeare, but the greatest writer about writers in the English language. Well, Samuel Johnson had a formidable intelligence. He was the subject of what's still probably considered the greatest biography ever written by James Boswell, who followed Johnson around for 20 years and wrote this mammoth biography in which the wit and the wisdom of Samuel Johnson comes through on almost every page. So Johnson was a formidable intelligence. Well, the one person in his lifetime that he was intimidated by was Edmund Burke. In fact, towards the end of his life, when he was ill, Burke arrived at his apartment, and Samuel Johnson instructed his assistant not to let him in. He felt he didn't have the strength to deal with Burke, the mental strength, the intellectual strength at that moment. Well, Burke wrote famously about the French Revolution. Reflections on the revolution in France. And in it, he argued against the concept of revolution because he felt that human beings were simply not smart enough to design a whole society, a whole system of government from scratch. He felt that governments, societies developed organically, and they integrated, again, it's a matter of convergence here. They integrated all kinds of subtle features, of lots of factors went in, and we just weren't smart enough to do it from a blank page, a blank sheet. Well, the founding fathers of the United States were obviously doing some such thing, but they were incorporating principles of conservatism to prevent, again, a concentration of power that would allow for just decision-making without enough consideration, just without proper perspective and deliberation, okay? So they were protecting us against ourselves, against our limitations, as much as anything. Okay, now, let me see. Okay, I think we have some time. Yes, good, okay. I wanted to make a few comments towards the end here on some issues that come up, like in the course of political campaigns, that have good answers that I don't always hear. Okay, and these issues come up in political campaigns, but they also come up in life. And so these are some things that are useful, I think, to have heard. Okay, one is you may feel, you may get the criticism of changing your point of view. You know, that you might have held one position and now you hold a different position, and you might be criticized for that. The philosopher Emerson, the American philosopher of the early 19th century, who was actually a teacher and a friend of Thoreau's. I talked about Thoreau's Walden a few weeks back. Emerson wrote before Thoreau and was a major influence upon Thoreau's writing. They are both called American transcendentalists. That's the sort of the philosophical designation given to what they were doing. They both subscribed, without articulating it, to what I've sort of expressed in aphoristic form: the past can't guarantee the future decides the past. So anything is still possible. So they, again, were articulating, expressing a view of how philosophy can free us from a sense of limitation. Okay, that's at the core, you know, of their work. Yeah, the final line, I think I might have mentioned this, of Thoreau's Walden is, "The sun is but a morning star," right? There's much more to come. We can't anticipate it, and we can't justifiably limit it in our minds. We can limit it in terms of our expectations, but not justifiably, not rigorously. It's similar to a comment that Shakespeare made in Hamlet. There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy, where philosophy is being used in the sense of a point of view, right? Not in the sense of the limit of rigor, okay? But Emerson wrote about, there's a kind of a famous remark he made, that consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. Okay, hobgoblin is not a term that we much use anymore, but the idea is that you don't need to worry about being consistent. He went on to say that he put into someone's had someone respond to that. Well, yes, but if I change my point of view, then I would be sure to be misunderstood. And Emerson famously responded, well, Jesus and Socrates and Luther and Copernicus and Galileo and Newton were all misunderstood. To be great is to be misunderstood. It's a famous sort of quotation from Emerson's writings. It's something that is expressed in different words by the 20th century economist, John Maynard Keynes. I very much like how the British sometimes put things into words. Keynes was actually at Cambridge in the early part of the 20th century. He was at Cambridge studying philosophy. He wanted to be a philosopher. He wanted to have a career in philosophy. Well, he was at Cambridge studying philosophy with Bertrand Russell, other famous philosophers. And then Wittgenstein arrived to study philosophy. And as soon as Keynes met Wittgenstein, he realized, this is not someone with whom I can compete philosophically. This is a philosophical mind at a much higher level than I can possibly aspire to. So he left philosophy and he devoted his life to economics. Well, and did fundamental work in economics. He was responsible for the economic theory of government involvement in helping nations rise out of depressions by stimulating spending, stimulating demand on the part of consumers once that demand had fallen off. And it was his economic theory that was behind Franklin Roosevelt's attempt at ending the Depression in the 1930s. It turns out that that effort was not quite successful because At that time, no one knew exactly how much spending was required, to stimulate an economy again. It turns out the amount of spending that was required was the amount of spending that World War II required. Germany was able to get out of its depression, in the late 20s, early 30s, because Hitler remilitarized the society and basically spent as if he were fighting a war, which he would soon fight. And that lifted the German economy out of the depression. So Keynes was right in terms of a means of ending a depression. It's just that we didn't yet know how much spending was necessary for that end to be accomplished. Well, Keynes famously responded to this issue. Someone accused him of changing his mind. And Keynes's response was, when the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do, sir? An excellent response. And it's something that you can use in your life, and it's something that candidates can use, but I don't see them use because, candidates tend to have a long, record of, public service or a long biography, and they often will have different positions at one point in time than at another. That's not necessarily, rigorously, that's fully justified, right? Rigor attends to all the details of a circumstance, and circumstances are inevitably changing. And so it would almost be surprising that our points of view didn't change, right? If they don't change, it's almost as if we're not incorporating all the features of the new circumstances in our assessment, okay? So that's a response. Another thing that I actually heard, it was in the middle of a news program, and I don't know who said this, but I heard Sartre quoted. The person was saying, a quotation by Sartre, to be is to do, where the emphasis is on our actions, not on our words. And you'll hear that, like it's not your words that matter, it's your actions that matter. Well, that position by Sartre was actually answered by a greater philosopher than Sartre, Wittgenstein, who said famously, words are deeds. In other words, words themselves are a kind of action and have to be taken seriously in the same way that actions are. Words facilitate actions. So again, if somebody criticizes you for being all words and no actions, like words or deeds, they have force as well and have to be taken seriously as well. And let's see, another thing that sometimes comes up is science. We've talked a lot about science. Science is our best guide to survival. What science is actually doing, and we'll talk about this more some other time, is finding strong convergence, elements that help us achieve a given end more effectively than lesser elements, lesser convergence. I won't go into that yet. And by the way, I say things, not everything I say has to be fully and completely understood when I say it. That's not how understanding works. And we don't just benefit from what we perfectly clearly understand the first time we hear. One of the greatest creative intelligences of all time was Picasso. And Picasso did not have a background in mathematics, but he spent a lot of time just glancing through textbooks of mathematics, textbooks of calculus. Not that he would understand what he was seeing, not that he would understand the formulas, not in terms that we would maybe traditionally consider understanding, but just seeing the formulas he found helped him, gave him a kind of understanding, a kind of insight. So I will say things knowing in some instances that they won't necessarily be fully understood. That's fine. It's helpful to hear them. So in the case of science, its results are not rigorous. And that applies, but even to conclusions like global warming, right? There's a lot of evidence for global warming, but the simple fact of the matter is it doesn't rise to the level of philosophical rigor. It can't. Nothing within science can. So through no fault of science, it's the nature of the enterprise. It does the best it can, but we can't go back in time, change something, and see what the result is. We can't go back in time, change something about how we relate to fossil fuels or use fossil fuels or burn fossil fuels and see if we had never consumed fossil fuels, there would not, have been global warming. Maybe there still would have. We can't do the controlled experiment at any level of science. So there's often a lot of, debate. Science is often used for various political purposes, but keep in mind, philosophy is rigorous, science not quite. Okay, I think that's a note that we can sort of end on at the moment, with the idea that obviously any of these things can be discussed further, right, from different directions or angles, and we'll gain more understanding, as we do so. Okay.
Yes, exactly. And we have questions from our viewers, so I will quickly go through.
Okay.
Ansar is asking, Mr. Friedman, elections are coming. Therefore, I have a question. What caused lie and provocation on any elections in the world? Is this, let's say, skills are essential parts of convincing people?
Okay. Again, there are all kinds of factors that influence people that will influence different people differently. And here's some insight into that. There was one of the things that we use to gain insight into candidates is debates, right? Candidates will debate. Presidential candidates will debate, senators will debate. It's a common way of seeing how people perform, under the stress, of debate. That's one thing that election campaigns do. They test this, candidates under stress, because being a president, being a senator, being a leader is stressful. And we're often asked to respond, to circumstances that are extremely demanding and extremely difficult. Well, the first major televised debate was in 1960 between Richard Nixon and John Kennedy. What's interesting is that, and that debate had such an impact that presidential debates became an important feature of elections mostly ever since. Not immediately after that. There was a gap of a few elections when debates were not held, but now it's become a prominent feature of the campaign process. Well, what's interesting is that people that watched that debate on television felt that John Kennedy had won, had given the stronger performance, the more compelling performance. People that listened to the debate on the radio thought Richard Nixon had won, had given the better performance. So there's an example of how all different types of factors, come together and influence us differently. I mean, there's, the candidates have speech writers, the way a speech is crafted, has an impact. We know how, like, if you're in, television, let's say you are on, some talk show or something, a news program, how carefully everything, or look at somebody like a celebrity like a Taylor Swift, how much goes into the crafting of her image, how she dresses, how she acts, what she says. All of these factors matter. Again, as of the sparrow, everything matters. What does matter isn't always isolatable. And what typically has an impact in terms of what we might call the gestalt of the situation. And remember, fundamentally, we can't ever do the controlled experiment. We can't ever sort of, for any given candidate, remove one aspect of that candidate and see what the difference is, to understand how a given factor of that candidate's behavior, appearance, presentation, choice of words. We can't ever decide, how the individual factors, weigh. All we can do is make an overall convergent choice, decision. I hope that.
Yes.
Yes.
And Sarah also has a question. When I was reading the Seneca's book, there was a words from Seneca to Paganini, his friend. You have only one life, believe me. So there is a question after this quote. Why people choose altruism, such as helping other people, spending time on other people, rather than being in charge of their own life?
Okay.
Yeah. There is a continuation.
Oh, there's more? Oh.
Going to government caused by no having opportunities to manage their lives. So it was my long question. We'll be happy if you could answer.
Oh, okay. What I always tell people when it comes to a matter of action, because again, everybody's circumstance is unique. Everybody is experiencing what they are experiencing. What you are seeing, what you are feeling is unique to you. No one has ever seen in detail what you're experiencing right now. No one has ever lived your life in its particular detail. So what has applied in terms of anybody else's decision-making does not, again, rigorously, philosophically, apply to your circumstance, which means ultimately, and this is the existential burden, you have to sum everything up yourself. And you have to make the decision for yourself in your circumstances because they are unique to you in all the world. Okay? It's almost cheating to use somebody else's behavior or patterns instead of making the decisions that are tailored to your circumstance. Now, what I tell people is, first, understand the nature of your circumstance. First, understand the truth of it. First, understand the rigor of it. First, understand what is genuine, and we haven't dealt with this, but we will, in the future. First, understand exactly what's in front of your eyes, that you can know without question. In other words, first understand the rigor of your circumstance, then act. Act in accordance with the nature that is yours alone. So ultimately, the question of how to act, when to act, in what direction, what to stress, is a matter of what only you are responsible for, because only you in detail experience your circumstances. I tell people that your fundamental responsibility is to the world as it presents itself to you. If we have different degrees of empathy to others. We have different degrees of human feeling. We are different as human beings. So it's not a matter of giving a general guideline. Under these circumstances, be giving to others. It's a question of and ultimately for philosophy, it's a question of, if you have no genuine needs that you can justify, how do you act? And normally, when there's nothing that you need, your concern for others tends to amplify, tends to take over, because you see that. You yourself begin to kind of fall away because you yourself see that you can't it's like an aphorism that I gave that undercuts a lot of pain and phobias. Selflessness, how one acts not out of need. Your needs are things you assume, but they can't be rigorously justified or established. So understand that you are in a situation of no particular need, and then you can address the needs of others if you see that they're in the pain that you no longer feel, because you have a philosophical understanding that they don't. It's a little bit like the bodhisattva ideal in Buddhism, that first achieve enlightenment, then act. But your first obligation is to understand the genuine truth of your circumstance. And that is tailored to your circumstance, because you can't leave the world to view it from the outside. So you have to address it from within, from where you stand. Okay.
Yes, and the very, very last essential questions from Ansar. Firstly, what books have changed Mr. Friedman's perception? Last but not least, what top 3 philosophical books can Mr. Friedman recommend us?
Okay, this is an excellent question. And this, should I answer it now, or should we wait for next week?
You could answer it now, but we also can receive the recommendations.
Let me answer it quickly now, but then let's go into it also in a little more detail next week. Okay, one book I absolutely recommend that's been a major influence upon my thinking in and outside of philosophy is a book by Andre Malraux, Malraux. I'll tell you more about this book next week. It's Anti-Memoirs, 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 Andre Malraux. I could spend the entire time next week talking about that book, and I actually can recite a lot of it. So that's the one book I would recommend. It's not easy to read, but it comes with my highest recommendation. For a long time, I had no interest in writing any books on my own because I thought Malraux had said everything in that book that I wanted to say. It was only when I had ideas that went beyond that book that I started to write. So that's the number one book. In terms of books of philosophy, the most important for me is Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations. But that's a book that usually demands a lot of background in not philosophy, but philosophical problems that he was addressing. So, but Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations, I also, in terms of getting a sense of those problems, I like Descartes' Meditations on a First Philosophy. That's the beginning of modern Western philosophy. And I happen to recommend like David Hume, an inquiry concerning human understanding, or a treatise of human nature. So I recommend Descartes, Hume, Wittgenstein. Descartes and Hume for getting a sense of the problems that then Wittgenstein addresses in a way that had not been addressed before. But there's a lot that we can talk about in terms of, kind of books in philosophy that I think are compelling. But those come immediately to mind, and that's what I recommend. But outside of philosophy, in terms of like a broad response to life and its major issues, Malraux, Anti-Memoirs.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for these recommendations and for answering all the questions for this great speech and session we had today. I also recommend, like, we will add these recommendations and books in our next poster. So please stay tuned, read it carefully, and prepare your questions for the next session so we can also be ready for them. And you also will not waste your time typing. Wish you all great weekend. Good luck and have amazing day today. Goodbye, all.
Thank you very much. Goodbye, everybody. Bye-bye.